Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to insert a compressor on a snare drum track. So compressors are used to manipulate the dynamic range of a signal to keep the loud parts under control. Sometimes they're used to manipulate the shape of the loud parts so that they can be a little bit softer or harder, entry point or transient. Sometimes they're used to raise the lower or softer parts of the signal. That's the main purpose that we tend to use compressors for today in popular music, is to narrow the dynamic range between the loud parts of a sound and the soft parts. If I zoom in real tight to this snare hit, you'll see that what happens when you hit the snare is it generates a fairly sudden loud sound, which we refer to as the transient, which then fades away into some kind of quite lengthy, sometimes, decay tail. So by using a compressor, what we can do is we can compress the level of the loud sounds by having a very fast manipulation of the gain and dropping the level of these hot transients so that the difference between the soft parts and the loudest part is smaller, and that allows us then to apply what's called makeup gain, and which is to crank the whole thing up louder then, and that has the effect of making the softer parts louder. The problem is that with a lot of acoustic signals, they have a very strong tangent, but their decays are quite weak, and it's the decay that gives the sound its kind of fullness and power, and sometimes you want to be able to make that decay last longer or sound louder. By compressing the loud transients, you can increase the overall gain without clipping. So I'll show you how to insert a compressor on this snare track. So we go up here to the inserts, click on one of the boxes, and I'm going to click on the second one. And so we go to dynamics, and we're just going to use a standard compressor limiter. What we're seeing here is a graphic display of the relationship of the signal coming in and going out. So we have the signal coming in and going out at the same ratio before it reaches the sort of orange line. So there's a 1-to-1 correspondence. It comes in at a -40 and it goes out at a -40. But when we get to the other side of the orange line, this is called the threshold, the relationship changes so that when it comes in at a -10, it only goes out at about a -18. So the louder sound, the -10, is squashed by the compressor down to about a -18. We can adjust the point where that curve changes by changing the threshold point. So there are a number of things to set on a compressor. One of them is the point where the compression actually kicks in. So everything to the left of the threshold, in other words, everything below, right now, 23.4 dBs, all the softer sounds are not being compressed, which would be appropriate. But then once the sounds get louder, we start to squash them a little bit. The attack and the release are how quickly the compressor actually responds to changes across the threshold. This is the speed that gain changes occur. With something like a snare, we want the attack to be very, very fast. We want to capture those very, very quick transients, and we basically want to get out of the way pretty quick too, so we want the release fairly short. The ratio is what determines this correspondence between input and output, and you'll see as I increase the ratio, the angle of the graph up to the right side of the threshold changes. So when the ratio is very low, it doesn't look like much of a difference in the change, but as you increase the number, it becomes very flat. And in other words, the higher the number, the more the difference is between the input and output, so to the point where we use what's called a brick wall. No matter how loud it gets, it never gets past that. So that's used sometimes in situations like broadcast, where you want to make sure you're not breaking somebody's speakers at home by a really loud sound accidentally. With something like this, we want to be in the neighborhood of about a 4, 5, or a 6. So again, we can bypass to hear what it sounds like. And then we can turn it back on, and you might say, well, that's not doing the job. It's not making it louder, it's actually making it softer, which it is at this point. But that's where this knob comes into play, the gain. Because as we now have reduced the loud sounds down, we can turn the whole thing up and increase the overall volume of the track. So it's a combination between setting the threshold point, determining how much of a ratio you want to have, in other words, how much of a gain reduction do you want to apply to the sounds above the threshold on the right, how quickly you want the compressor to react in terms of coming on and going off, and then how much you can actually increase the sound without clipping. And you'll see it clip here on the red light if I turn it up too loud. So you hear if I set the gain way up on this, you'll get clipping. We want to avoid that. Just click the red light to make it go off. Watch the input and output levels to make sure that you're not sending a signal down the signal path that's too hot. But now, as we have the gain set up, we've added 16 dB, almost 17 dB of signal to the snare. If I turn the bypass off, you'll see how much softer it is with the bypass in place. This is what the signals sound like originally. This is how much I've been able to increase its volume by using some compression. So it's a balancing act between these various parameters, trying to sort of sculpt the dynamic shape of the sound. One last setting that you might want to mess with is called the knee. The knee is what the shape of the curve is like at the threshold point. So you can see that the higher the number of the knee, the more curvy it is approaching the threshold. This is called a hard knee or a soft knee. Hard knee meaning that it's very angular, that it makes an abrupt change at the point of the threshold. Soft knee is a gradual change of the ratio. Usually a hard knee is a more aggressive sound and a soft knee is a more natural sound. And so somewhere in the middle, depending on the style of the music and the situation, you can kind of custom tailor that. But in general, the softer the knee, the more natural the transition across the threshold sounds. Okay, that's how to put a compressor on a track as an insert. See you later. Bye.